Every once in a while, I go and check out the ports for sale on COMC, but 99.9% of the time, the ports are either just way above my budget or really terribly priced or just nothing I'm interested in. But then I saw this port I'm going to show you, and it piqued my interest. I had never before bought a port, and the cards in this port were not the kind of thing I usually look for. It's almost all non-sports related, and a lot of it is vintage pre-war cigarette cards from a time when it would have been vintage even at a time when a lot of what we consider today as vintage were brand new, hot off the presses. And that's really what got me to go ahead and purchase this port. It's a big pile of antiques and unusual stuff to learn about. Let's check it out. This lot consisted of 70 cards, and I got it all for $60, so less than $1 per card. After I scroll through these and give you a bit of an overview, I'm also going to share with you some of what I've learned about these different card sets, because really, a big reason I bought this was because I thought there'd be some cool stuff to learn in the mix, and there definitely was. There's some really interesting stories in here. Plus, getting a bunch of 19th century cards for under $1 a piece just wasn't something I could pass on, so that by itself was really cool for me. I mean, some of these cards are 130 years old. That's awesome. 1890s, Sweet Caporal Actors and Actresses, Tobacco N245 cards. 21 of the 70 cards in this port were from this set. So that means I'm only 21 2,400ths away from completing the complete set. Yeah, it's a monster of a set. Jefferson Burdick, who I have mentioned in an earlier video when I was talking about the T206 set, he was an early 20th century card collector, historian, and documentarian. Is that a word for a dude that documents stuff? I'm not sure. He said that to his knowledge, this was the largest set of cards ever created as far as the number of different cards in the set. The name designation N245 also comes from Jefferson Burdick, as he wrote the 1939 book called The United States Card Collectors Catalog, which kind of documented and organized all the different cigarette cards and trading cards from before that time. That T from T206 was his designation. That was a tobacco card from the 20th century, and this N from this N245 was his designation for cigarette cards from the 19th century, so even older back. Value-wise, these are actually some of the least monetarily valuable 19th century cards you can find, which actually is perfect for my PC because I love inexpensive things that tell a story and connect with history. So for me, these are awesome. To be honest, if these were really valuable, I'd be unlikely to actually keep any of them for myself because I don't really like owning expensive stuff. But since they're pretty cheap and they have this extreme, kind of historical context, this historical connection, I'm going to pick out a handful of these that I'm going to keep for my PC and figure out what to do with the other ones. I'm still kind of reflecting on that. The story about these cards I discovered from prewarcards.com, which is a great site if you're interested in learning about different older vintage sets. These cards were issued inside of Sweet Caporal cigarettes. Now, in my video on the history of sports cards, which I'll link here, I talked a lot about the origin story of trading cards being inserted in cigarette packs during the later part of the 19th century. The cigarette companies used cards like these instead of plain little cardboard rectangles to keep the side of the pack stiff, so as to protect the cigarettes from getting crushed. And the whole idea of trading cards as a hobby emerged from that practice. And this is part of the reason I find these particular cards so fascinating, because since they're from 1890, they really do have a direct connection to those early days of the existence of the hobby. I personally think it's really cool that I now own some of these 130-year-old connections to the origins of the hobby. The people on these cards are actresses from the time, but being that this was a time before movies were really much of a thing, most of the actresses in this set are not known today. I say movies weren't much of a thing because these did come out right around the same time that motion pictures were first being invented. The first motion picture ever recorded was 10 years earlier in 1878. Here's a little tidbit from that. But movies weren't part of the popular culture or anything yet, and the technology was really just in its absolute infancy. So the actresses in this set were more stage actresses. There are a few names from this set that are historically more significant. For example, the most valuable card in this set is usually the Lillian Russell card, since she was one of the most famous actresses of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Unfortunately, I don't have that particular card in this set, but I might look into it, as even the most expensive card from this set is really usually quite inexpensive, like under $20. Maybe you can even find it for $10. And supposedly the Lillian Russell card is actually one of the easiest of the set to find because there's actually a market for buyers and sellers, pretty regularly. The backs of these cards had a few variants, although most were the ones you saw. these ones, with the vertical sweet capital advertisement. The two that are considered to be the variants are the upside down printing of that single one, which I do have here. And then the most rare variant is the back here, this one that says beware of imitations and some other stuff and is horizontal, which I also happen to have one in this port as well. So I somehow managed to get all three of these different variations in my little 21 card lot of them. I think that's pretty cool. I might possibly just keep one of each of the different backs as my PC. Maybe I'll keep 3 of these for my PC. Now, before moving on to the next set, there's one other just brief one to mention. There was one single 1890s N392 card. Put that here. That's basically the same story as the N245 cards I've been talking about here, but it was for the Admiral cigarette packs instead. Otherwise, the story is basically the same. 1910 to 1912 ATC Flags of All Nations T59. Moving up in time, but still more than 100 years ago, we come to what makes up another 10 cards of the 70 card port I bought. These are flags of the world issued in 3 different years between 1910 and 1912. 7 of the 10 cards that I bought are called T59 Flags of All Nations cards. We know from the T designation, the same as T206 cards, that means it's a 20th century tobacco card. These T59 cards could be found in 11 different tobacco products in 1910 and 1911. The T59 cards were issued in 4 different series, the first being major countries, the second being smaller nations, the third being major cities, and the fourth being nautical flags and yacht club banners. I'd guess based on that maybe my Austria card was from series 1, probably my British Samoa and Danish West Indies cards were from series 2, my Anhalt Cape Conley, which I think is actually Cape Town, and St. Petersburg cards were series 3, and my Royal Irish Yacht Club was series 4. Again, I find that really cool. There's just 7 cards, and I think I got at least 1 from every series. That's pretty cool. The other 3 of these 10 flag cards I'm having trouble learning more about. They don't seem to fall into the same T59 card set, but they're definitely something somewhat similar. But I couldn't really figure out what they are. The 2 Brazil ones are labeled as leather, and the Persia one is labeled as felt. So my guess is that they aren't so much cards as they are some other card-like fabric collectible. But I'm pretty sure I'm going to keep that Persia one for my PC and maybe one of those Brazil ones as well. They're pretty cool, and they're 110 years old. Just as a quick side note here, I also couldn't find much information about the 1910 ATC Plants and Flowers cards in this lot, which are these ones. Those ones are also labeled on COMC as silks, so my only guess is that they're also in the same general idea as those Brazil and Persia flag cards that are like fabric card-like collectibles, but these ones made of silk. 1910 to 1912 ATC College Pennants Leathers L21 and ATC College Seals Leathers L20. So another 9 of the 70 cards in the port I bought are from these 2 sets. The L designation stands for leathers. Quite a number of the leather cards from different releases were from college releases, including the 9 here that I bought. The 6 L21 cards are of pennants of different universities, and the 3 L20 cards are the seals of different universities. I personally don't have any connection with any of the universities here, so I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with these. My thought currently is I might save them as gifts if I meet people who happen to have connections with any of these universities at some point, but otherwise I'm not quite sure. But they're 110 years old. Super cool. 1935 and 1938 Arm & Hammer Useful Birds of America, Series 7 and Series 9. Now, it was a surprise for me to discover that bird trading cards have a history as old as baseball cards. As far back as the 1880s, there have been bird trading cards, and even today, the Goodwin Feathered series actually has for itself a decent little collector base. Might I add, just as a side note here, I've actually sold a number of those in China because I find that, on COMC, I can buy those Goodwin Feathered cards sometimes for very cheap, and they always sell quite well for auction in China. So I've sold, 10 of them or something so far. So unexpected, but they seem to do well in China. These ones here, this is the 1935, most of the 1935, and then one of them is from the 1938 set, and they were contained in Arm & Hammer products of the time, and then later they could be specially ordered through the mail. The idea of the cards that were released originally in the 1880s, and these ones were inspired from those, was to show how important birds were to the natural ecosystem of things so that people would stop killing off wild birds for fun. The set that came out in the 1880s had the same name as this set, Useful Birds of America, and this name was chosen to really highlight how these birds were really important and should be protected. Each card included a write-up about each bird, as well as having an Arm & Hammer advertisement on it. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with these cards. I don't really have any draw to keep them. I may send a couple of them in my next batch to China to see how they do on the Chinese domestic market, and then hold on to the other ones and then kind of make some decisions after I've seen what happens. happens. But this is kind of cool. And, you know, again, this is another one that's like, what, almost 90 years old. So I love having that kind of connection with history. 1938 Exhibit Movie Stars. The next two oldest cards are from the 1938 cards of a few famous actors. It turns out in the 1930s there was quite a large number of different movie star related sets, and these exhibit ones seem to be one of the many different sets. Pretty cool. I don't have any connection with these characters or these actors specifically, but pretty cool. 1953 and 1954 Dixie lids. The next three oddball collectibles in this port are the peeled off lid toppers of Aristocratic and Nelson ice cream from 1953 and 1954. There's a few different Dixie lid sets that are collectible today, including some baseball ones that are pretty popular with some people. These three here are all from movie actors and actresses of the time. The 1953 set had 24 different names in total, including quite a few famous actors of the time like John Wayne, Gene Kelly, Elizabeth Taylor, Bing Crosby, and Clark Gable, among many others. 1959 Topps Telus Fabian. The next four cards in the port are from this 55-card 1959 top set that focused on the American singer and actor known as Fabian. He was a teen idol in the 50s and 60s and had 11 hits that reached the Billboard Top 100 list. He was kind of like the pop culture bad boy after James Dean. After his music success, he acted in a handful of movies that were popular among the teen crowd. If you go scroll through his Wikipedia page, you can learn a lot more about him. I'm not interested enough to keep talking about him, but I'm probably just going to reflip these ones right back up on COMC, I think. 1962 Post. The next three cards from this port are the first sports cards we've looked at in the video thus far. The 1962 Post serial football cards were a set of 200 cards that were printed on the back of cereal boxes and would need to be manually cut off. Some of the cards in this set can actually be pretty highly sought and fetch some good prices if they're in good condition, like the Jim Brown card, the Fran Tarkenton rookie card, and a handful of other Hall of Famers. 1977 APBA Baseball. The next card on this list is just one card, but it is Hank Aaron, which definitely made it intriguing to me at first, despite the fact that there's no photo or anything of Aaron, just his name and a bunch of seemingly random numbers. What this actually is, I discovered, is a card from a baseball strategy card game by a company called APBA, who has been making sports card strategy games since 1951 and continues to be in business today. 1992 Hutt River Province Fathers of Baseball. Now at first I almost just skipped past this card since we're all the way up into the junk wax era at this point, but this card actually has its own little story. So let me share this because it's quite fascinating. These Father of Baseball cards were issued in connection with coins featuring the same individuals. The coins themselves were quote unquote minted by a farmer who didn't want to pay his taxes, and so he quote unquote seceded his farm from Australia. Supposedly, as well as minting his own coins, he also issued his own stamps and visas and turned his farm into an eccentric tourist destination that was supposedly succeeded from Australia. Supposedly still to this day, Hutt River Province still exists, and exists in some sort of gray area between being part of Australia and not being part of it. Supposedly at the time, it was very easy for him to legally secede, sort of, but they've changed rules and made it much harder now. If somebody says they are seceding from Australia, the government people just say, no, you aren't, and then they can't. But they didn't do that at this time, so this guy's farm kind of exists in some sort of gray area between being part of Australia and not being part of Australia. So kind of hilarious. So that makes this card extra interesting. 1998 Walrus the Beatles. Now the last 7 cards in this port are all Beatles cards from 1998. Walrus, the company that made these cards, released 26 different 10-card sets of the Beatles, as well as one of the Rolling Stones. For each set, they limited the printing to just 2,000 per card. Now, I couldn't figure out details for how these were released, so if you do know something, let us know in the comments below, but they were referred to as cigarette cards in more than one place on the internet, so I don't know if maybe they're associated with a cigarette company or something. I can't even actually figure out any details about who Walrus even is, aside from being the producer of these card sets in 1998. So again, if you know anything, let us know. But this is cool stuff, I think, especially considering I got 70 different cards in all these different kind of oddball categories for a total of just $60. That's it for this video. Peace.